Thank you so much, Dr. Shahbaz, for this insightful, very, very insightful and interesting lecture and talk. I just waiting for audiences for their comments, their question, and Dr. Tavakoli, would you please?
Thank you for your outstanding and inspiring presentation. And thank you for the time that you have spent on producing such an outstanding scholarship. The two issues that I want to sort of focus on, you talked about Zīb al-Nisā and Hafiz and imitation. Could we consider that instead of imitation, the poems that you recited, a sort of Zīb al-Nisā's removal of the time distance between herself and Hafiz, and her engagement in a dialogue with Hafiz, because the way she articulates her response is not imitation, but it actually responding to Hafiz as if they are sitting together and having an active dialogue. That's one. The other one is what you talked about, her sort of not associating with India. Actually, the way I read it was that آفرین بر جگرم باد که در کشور هند سکه سخن رایج ایران زده ام. That indicates that even in India, I write poetry that is current in Iran, because during her lifetime, there was a sense that some Iranians claim that Indian poets are inferior, Indian Persian writers are inferior to the original Iranians. And she claims that she's doing a poetry that is, if not as good, but better than Iranians. I wouldn't see that self-distancing from India, but since the language, common language was Persian, asserting the mastery of Persian language that she had acquired in India.
Thank you very much. Regarding the first point you mentioned, I find it very interesting. Your interpretation is very interesting, and it makes sense because Zīb al-Nisā in Tazkirat had been praised for her great skill in spontaneity, in composing verses in everyday matters, about everyday matters. In one case, there is an anecdote that says one of her maidens broke the mirror, which she was bringing to her so that she could see herself in the mirror. But then once it's broken, the maiden says, "Az qaza aine chini shekast," and Zīb al-Nisā immediately replies back in form of dialogue, "Khub shod, asbab khudbini shekast." And as you say, well, I can imagine that Mazandarani, while he was teaching Zīb al-Nisā poetry, made her read a lot of poetry coming from Sa'di and Hafiz, and maybe somehow urged her to write replies, as you put it, or a form of dialogue to reply back to the poet. I think your interpretation completely makes sense. Regarding the second one, it's true that she at several points she expresses the fact that she's not well understood in India, or her worth is not appreciated as it should. And if she were in Iran, her situation might have been different. But at the same time, we know that the Safavids did not really patronize Persian literature, and they, let's say, that was the reason why many poets and scholars from Iran immigrated to India and took refuge to the Mughal court. Yeah. We need to think about it.
Just to add to that, I think maybe Iran here is sort of a heterotopia of Persian language that is imagined, and not comparing India to actual Iran. You know, sort of, it may be a poetic trope of some sort, rather than the actual polity of Iran and situations that she's missing.
Like homeland for Persian language, not for...
No, homeland, so in a sense, a heterotopia of excellence in Persian language. Again, putting it in the context of the kind of controversies that were in India among Indian Persian speakers and Iranians who were speaking Persian, writing and were employed in India.
Let's have a look if we have time. Let's have a look, because this is intriguing. Let's have a look at the couplets together. So the one that you referred to was this one. آفرین بر جگرم باد که در کشور هند سکه نقد سخن رایج ایران زدم. So this Iran, yeah.
سخن رایج ایران زدم is not inferior Persian language. Is as good.
Yes. But this couplet is different from the other examples.
Right. I'm just suggesting a sort of a way of reading against the grain that sort of talks about superiority of Iranians over Indians, and not sort of be caught in that controversy, but read beyond it. And also in regards to Hafiz and Zīb al-Nisā, it's to see how, if you read it as a dialogue with a man, her femininity actually comes out really well in those poems and in those responses.
True. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tavakoli. The next question comes from Mr. Salman Qureshi.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed your lecture, but I have two comments. And because you dwelt so much on the religious bigotry of Aurangzeb, I know there was a recent book by Professor Audrey Tushkin. Yeah. So, you know, I think that argues, and I wish you had pointed out it. Yeah, so at least her take.
Talk about it, yes.
Yeah, but sure. You know, that to make a statement that Aurangzeb was bigoted after her book would be really unfair, because I think what she argues is that he was religious, very pious, and obviously he did persecute his brothers and all that, but he commissioned and paid money for as many temples, perhaps more than he destroyed. So that was one point. And secondly, I tend to second, Professor Tavakoli's take on preference for Iran versus India, because, you know, Mughals for generations settled in India. I mean, they didn't go back, and generation after generation. And to think that there would be this person who would really regret being in India, it's difficult to believe. So just these two comments.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very glad that the comments are coming on this about this particular slide, because I also found it controversial, and I even thought maybe that these couplets may not be from her. So regarding your first comment, Audrey Tushkin's book, well, of course, historians are human beings, and the historical views have to be reviewed generation after generation, and this is what Audrey Tushkin has done. And what she basically wants to say is not denying the fact that Aurangzeb did a lot of oppression. She's trying to say that compared to the previous rulers or the Mughal rulers, it was not anything more tyrant than them. He was a Mughal ruler like any other Mughal ruler, but this does not actually cover up what he did, for example, regarding Darashukru. So I was not trying to demonize Aurangzeb. It was just an introduction to just speak of how he saw Zenana differently, saw women differently from the previous Mughal rulers, because Akbar was the first person who created Zenana or harem. Before that, the Mughals were always on the move, living in the camps, and women would travel with them to battles of war and lived in tents and camps. Akbar was the first person who created an institution as harem was. And then Abul Fazl says that Akbar had over 5,000 women in the harem. Not all of them were begums, not all of them were concubines, but still it shows how, let's say, grandiose that institution was. So with a specific type of budget, and people who were recruited to guard these women. And Jahangir did the same, and it continued. But what happened at Aurangzeb's period was that he somehow limited anything that was related to, let's say, women Zenana. And so talking about India in Zīb al-Nisā's poetry, yes, I look forward to hearing more and more. Because this is very controversial, actually. I personally thought maybe these verses come from an Iranian immigrant poet who traveled to India and then was longing to go back to Persia, and so he or she wrote these poems. But if we imagine, we still consider Zīb al-Nisā as the author of these couplets. Is it because she spent the last decades of her life in prison?
Yeah. I would go to this other poem to show that the alternative reading is possible. It says, دل آشفته مخفی به فن خود ارسطویی است. به هند افتاده است اما خراسان است یونانش. Right? Here it's sort of an ideal place, or sort of what I refer to as heterotopia, rather than, and if you look at it that way, it will move us out of this sort of old cliche kind of controversy.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Dr. Khan.
Okay, so let me place the devil advocate here. I think both sides have merit to reading a poetry. Poetry is not a document of facts in that sense that it allows for multiple reading. But let's stick to the point that she is in fact claiming Iranian origin or Iranian ancestry or Iranian legitimacy. But as a historian, and from the work on parties at Mughal court, the Turani, Irani, and the Indian politics that scholars at Aligarh have shown, the point is not to say they actually were dealing about nationality. The point is, how did these factions operate in battles about succession, on questions of authorities, particularly in the Zenana? Now, one of the ways to think about Zenana is not to just think about the number of concubines, but to think of Zenana as a site of extreme politics. And this is very much from the time of Akbar till much later. So one historically situated reading of insistence on foreign origin would be to think of this as authority, both poetic but also political authority, in the sense that I would read the insistence on Kufr of India as also a commentary on her father, who was claiming religious authority, And here is she telling about her authority of what is Islamic or what is not Islamic, which was one of the reasons I believe her father was deeply turned against her on her insistence on critiquing her father being actually violating a lot of Islamic theological rules while making a claim of himself being a pious ruler. So one would be to bring some of the debate, historical debate that she was fighting within the court politics, siding with brother, father, and in some way using religious idiom as a form of authority. That would be a political reading, though. But I think the poetic authority concept is also interesting because, again, she could have potentially also used Arabic, but she insists on using Farsi here. So, what are ways in which we think about claiming Persian authority in a culture where she could have potentially also used other forms of poetic authority? So, I'm in fact curious if you have some thought on her engagement with Arabic. I believe she was trained in Arabic quite fluently. What are ways in which, why an insistence on Persian, and why be a poetess when she could also have been a theologian? So I'm just interested in seeing what is her relationship with language. And I think there is something to be probed about the insistence on mastery of Farsi as also a way of distinction with other people around. She's also claiming a mastery of the poetic language. So just some thoughts on situating poetry and politics as forms of authority or as forms of what I call poetic sovereignty. If you could say something on that. Sorry for that long winding question, but this is just to bring the historian and the literary scholarship together.
That's great. Thank you very much. The question of authority, we are in the 17th century, second half of 17th century. And it's when Persian is not only the language of Muslims anymore. There are non-Muslims who use Persian, who master Persian, who communicate in Persian, and who do translations directly from vernacular Hindis, Braj Bhasha, Hindavi, Awadhi, or even Sanskrit into Persian. If we were in the 14th century, I would have seen Persian language as a means of authority. But in the second half of 17th century, close to the 18th century, it's not the same. Persian does not have the same situation. I think Persian is non-static then. Persian is not static anymore. Persian is used in the bazaars, in the camps, among the masses, the people, regardless of their religion. So that's also important. In the second half of the 17th century, I do not see Persian merely as the language of Persia. I personally see Persian as one of the languages of India.
Yeah, but that does not discount the question of poetic mastery. So people may speak Farsi, and I think we need to debate how many people actually spoke Farsi. I think this has not been actually debated historically. I think there are hierarchies within Farsis, within the Indian history, that have simply not been documented. It's one thing to say that Persian was Indianized, but who actually was speaking it? The second would be if people were speaking Farsi, as Muzaffar Alam calls it, the language of governance, they were not mastering, not everybody was allowed to have a Divan in Farsi. And if you manage, not every Divan was accepted. She manages to actually claim herself as a poetic authority. So I'm sorry, I'm pushing back on it because I think there's a way in which here she's refashioning a form of authority, both Islamic, but also poetic. And this is important vis-a-vis her fight with her father, who basically, despite all the rhetoric, was a profoundly not a very interesting intellectual person compared to the people around him. So there is a way in which I would read a lot of this rhetoric also against her father. Although he is missing probably directly, but there's good reason to see it as poetry in that sense allows for that multiple reading. surely his father must have encountered this poetry. Indeed, this is the major archive of her that survives now. So what I'm suggesting, and I think this is purely coming from a historian, is to situate literary texts within the political formation. And you must, by 17th century, indeed, if you remember Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last remnant for him was poetry. When he was imprisoned, what he did was write poetry. So when you are imprisoned, your true weapon, or perhaps your only weapon, is poetry. And therefore, now most of the people quote Bahadur Shah Zafar's poetry as his form of critique of imprisonment, as well as colonial rule. So also focusing on this as imprisoned poetess. This is not a poetess who's willfully choosing her choices. And there's a lot of element of imprisoned poet trying to articulate a sovereignty here. And therefore sovereignty in time of imprisonment becomes an unspoken structure here in a way. I'm sorry, I think I've spoken more than what I think is in the text, but I suppose the political context matter here.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I took notes. I will certainly take your comment into account. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, would you please to answer, Dr. Khan, continue to answer, or we just go to next question, Dr. Shah?
The point that he mentioned is actually important, that she was in prison and she wrote poetry in prison, and that was the a means of protesting against the situation in which she was. She herself says, در سخن مخفی شدم مانند بود در برگ گل. میل دیدن گر که داری میل دیدن هر که دارد در سخن بیند مرا. So she's expressing her thoughts, her religious attributes, as you mentioned, her disagreement with her father through her poetry. It actually makes sense, totally makes sense, yes.
Okay,
We have a poet, we have a poet of the 11th century, Mas'ud Sa'd Salman, who also has Habsiyas, poetry written in prison once he was in prison. It would be also not a bad idea to look into both and see how both Habsiyas
okay, thank you.
On the topic of prison, yes.
I think that Andrea has a question that's somehow related to Dr. Khan. That's why she mentioned, and for a long time she raised her hand. Andrea, would you please ask your comments, tell your comments and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. I wasn't going to ask it because I'm not an expert in poetry. I know very little, actually. So I'm really enjoying the entire lecture series. And thank you so much, Dr. Shahbaz, for the wonderful talk. And actually, what Dr. Khan was mentioning about the idea of writing poetry as resistance and a way of asserting one's sovereignty when one is in prison is so interesting, because of course it has so many contemporary connections, constantly to the global stage. But I was also thinking about the concept that you mentioned, Dr. Shahbaz, tafahur, I guess. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the tendency to self-glorification that is emerging. So, as a female poet, the tendency to self-glorification that you've identified in the poetry, is that, can you talk a little bit more about that? My particular comment was based on a concept that I learned from the scholar Roxanne Varzi, who wrote an anthropological account of the issue of martyrdom relating to the Iran-Iraq war. And she brought up a concept called bi-khodi, or self-annihilation, or the renunciation of the self, which she points out is related to Sufi theological or Sufi mysticism. And this inspired the young soldiers who were willing to sacrifice their lives. So anyway, this idea that you presented of self-glorification, I'm wondering if it is related to Sufi tenets, or then in the light of Dr. Khan's comments on the need to assert the self. Could you maybe reflect on that? And sorry if it's a bit convoluted.
Thank you very much. Both your questions are very interesting and thought-provoking. In Persian literature, we have a very well-known tradition of tafakhur, or self-glorification. And the master of self-glorification is Hafiz, by chance, who is also sometimes seen as a Sufi poet. So in the mystical concept, we have this self-annihilation, as you mentioned, and I have come across some verses from Zīb al-Nisā as well, in which she advises herself and others to be more humble, more modest, and avoid somehow tame their self. This is certainly a mystical Sufi concept, but at the same time, we have great Sufi poets who do self-glorification. When it comes to literature, they praise their own ability, skill in composing poetry. When Hafiz says, صبحدم از عرش می آمد خروشی عقل گفت قدسیان گویی که شعر حافظ از بر می کند. So it's at the same time very mystical. At the same time, he's glorifying his state in poetry, his level of poetry, to the level that even the angels are reciting his poems at dawn, and them reciting Hafiz's poetry wakes Hafiz up in the morning. That's very, a kind of there's a humor also involved in it. Yeah, it's very. There are two themes that seem to be paradoxical, seem to be opposing one another, but to me they are not opposing one another, because one belongs to the religion, the category of religion, let's say themes, and the other one belongs to the language skill in composing poetry. It was like a literary model that poets learned to practice and to produce poetry following that model. They seem to be opposing to one another, but at the same time, you can find both of them in one couplet by Hafiz, as in the example that I mentioned. We are getting into this melancholic circle of being, a unity of being and not being.
That was wonderful. I just learned so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for your question. Thank you.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have one question in chat. Khurshid Shekari, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question from Dr. Shahbaz?
Good evening. I had a question related to the Divan makhfī. I was curious to know if the Divan makhfī has ever been illustrated by someone in history. That was my question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
An interesting question. I have not seen a manuscript illustrated yet, but this also doesn't mean that it does not exist. We, unfortunately, I have not had the chance to consult these manuscripts. There might be, there might not be, don't know.
Thank you very much.
Normally illustrations were in book culture, Persian book art and culture, illustrations were done for prominent literary works, mostly narratives, fiction, and specific scenes were illustrated. For example, in all the Khamsas quintet by Nizami, you find the picture of Shirin in bath in the lake, being seen by, observed by Khosrow. This was also another tradition. In all the paintings of the Shahnameh, there is a scene of battle with a dragon, for example. The scenes were already selected, and for each manuscript, the same scenes were produced. We rarely come across manuscripts that do not follow this model. For makhfī, again, I have to say, unfortunately, I have not seen the manuscripts personally.
Thank you very much.
In the chat, Roxana asked you that's a fascinating presentation. This great presentation to be published?
Actually, yes, I have to prepare an entry for the compelling project of Professor Tavakoli-Targhi. Of course, certainly an article will be out of it.
Okay, great. And there are many comments you can see in the chat about that's fascinating, very informative. And I just want, if Roxana, would you please unmute yourself and if you have any question?
I wanted to thank Doctor for such a great presentation. I think it's particularly impressive because we have so little information about women who practice Sufism. And from my own experience, I've been raised in a family where a lot of women of my family were very much in tune with Sufi practice and Sufi poetry. Yet when I went to do research on how women practice Sufism, there's absolutely nothing. There is such a dearth of literature on how women practice Sufism, how women express themselves as Sufi. And I'm really excited, and I look forward to the publication of this presentation. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is also an important point, and I have to say, women Sufis in South Asia had more liberty and more possibilities to express themselves. It's a cultural thing. From Roshan Ara, Zīb al-Nisā's aunt, we have several letters in which she speaks of her personal feelings and observations, her spiritual experiences, clearly explained to her Sufi master. And then the Sufi master analyzes everything and writes back. Well, I think I already mentioned in one of the sessions this point. We have a pre-Makkian narrative tradition in Persian literature of South Asia, which is derived from Indian, let's say, Sufi tradition. And it consists of stories, love stories, romances. The stories are, of course, metaphorical and, let's say, symbolic. The couple represent the lover and the love he or she expresses for the divine beloved. But in pre-Makkian Indian tradition, contrary to what we see in literature in Iran or Turkey, the lover is a woman. In love romances, devotional poetry produced in India, it's the woman who is the lover. It's the woman who is the salik, who is the Sufi in seeking the divine beloved. And the man, the husband, represents the divine. And so it's her who, the whole story revolves around the woman figure who does a lot of sacrifice and goes against the, let's say, norm of the society, does what is prohibited in Sharia because it makes sense in Tariqah, in order to reach union with her beloved, even if it's out of the frame of marriage. So I think it's also very much cultural. In South Asian cultural background, we have, even in music today, you see music, Sufi music today. In South Asia, we have prominent singers who are women, while, for example, in Iran or in Central Asia, we don't have Sufi singers, women singers. Very few. I don't know any of.
If I may say one word, is that the fact that there are no written records doesn't mean that it wasn't practiced.
Are you sure there is no written record? We have large corpus of manuscripts which are under research and not worked. Nobody has worked on them. How can we be sure? But every scholar of Persian literature seeks to work on Shahnameh or Mawlavi Rumi or Hafez. But Persian literature is not only Rumi, Nizami, Ferdowsi, and Hafez. We have loads of texts which are not yet studied, and they are still in manuscript format. It's our work, it's something that we have to work on. I'm not sure if there is, I'm not sure that there's not much material. Maybe we do not know yet. We have not.
I meant women poet, female poet. The records of female Sufi poets are not a reflection of what it actually existed. That's my take on historical record of female poet. I'm talking about Iran, of course, not South Asia. Oh, thank you very much. Very enjoyable, very insightful, very educative.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the publication.
Sure.
Okay, I do not see any hands up and any question in the chat. Just everybody, thank you for great presentation, insightful and informative presentation, Dr. Shahbaz. I just echo all audience's comments. And we really enjoy, and I myself learned a lot. And thanks to audiences for this engaging conversation and comments and their question. I just want to say again, thank you, Dr. Shahbaz, and all audiences. And Dr. Tavakoli, it's done from my side.
Yeah, I also like to join everyone and to add that this was a brilliant presentation, really highly learned, well contextualized, and the conversation that we had and the brilliance of it has to do with the kind of conversation that has generated. And another area that I really think, particularly this poet, needs to be articulated is on the notion of individuality, subject formation, personhood. The poetry, she's there. The self is at the heart of it. And this notion of self in her poetry precedes the romantic sense of the self in Europe, which is in late 18th century. And I think that needs to be articulated and bring it out. I think you have done an outstanding work, and we look forward to having this as one of the first entries in Woman Poets Compendium.
Sure.
We are very excited and looking forward to see your.
Thank you so much. I also learned a lot from the discussion we had after the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody, and have a wonderful Friday night, evening, morning, I don't know, different time zone, and have a wonderful weekend. We are looking forward to see you next week for another webinar series that we have on the cinema, and then in 2 weeks again for women poetry.
Thank you.
Bye everybody.
Bye everyone. Good
Shahbaz,
night.
Bye.
Dr. Shahbaz. Bye-bye.
Bye.